Hello, and thanks for tuning in. This is We the People. My name is Brett Maurer. I'm the host of this new podcast. With this being a new podcast, we obviously don't have much content out just yet. So I just wanted to give a little bit of information about what you can expect to be coming out. So, as you can see on the homepage of my YouTube channel, there are three different sections. So there is the history section, there's the politics section, and then there is a miscellaneous section. The history section, like this, we will talk about different historical events and places, and maybe even some historical figures. One of the things I'd really like to cover on this channel is figures that have been lost to history, and I'd like to bring their stories back into the narrative. On the politics channel, you're going to be able to hear me discuss different political issues on the table and maybe some of the information surrounding those. And I'll also be trying to get guest speakers and things like that on all of these channels to have a little bit deeper discussions and debates about things. And then on the miscellaneous channel, you're going to see different podcasts for random things. I'll do some on just kind of Q&A. I'll do some for maybe different sports. I know someone has already asked for me to do some kind of gardening tips podcast. So those are things that will be coming out. I right now have one video in each slot. So feel free to go and watch those also and give me some feedback on what you think. This is the one that I filmed first, so I'm kind of trying to experiment with it and see what works and what doesn't. So today I want to talk about a figure that has kind of been lost to history. And it's really important to me that we talk about figures that are lost to history for a few reasons. One, myself being a historian, or studying to be a historian rather, we talk about it all the time that history, the victors in history write the narrative. And while that's true, it's also up to the future generations to go back and correct that narrative. So even now in the modern day, we consider the victors of the colonization period to be Europeans that came and took the land for themselves. And a lot of the history surrounding that was written by the Europeans. And so historians have had to create the accurate narrative by taking the European sources with a grain of salt and trying to input opinions from, say, native groups into that to create a whole picture. So that's one of the things that I'd like to do with this history channel, is I'd like to discuss people that, because of outdated beliefs and stereotypes, were left out or had their story removed when it should rightly be put into history. And the one example I can think of for this is the movie Hidden Figures. For anybody that doesn't know what Hidden Figures is, it is a movie that was primarily based on three women. Okay, and these three women all worked for NASA and played key roles in not only integrating the woman but also people of color into NASA, but they also were the great minds behind being able to get John Glenn into space. And it's people like Katherine Johnson, Dorothy Vaughan, and Mary Jackson that have had their narratives taken out of history and left out of history because of these outdated stigmas. And it's up to historians and filmographers and all these other professions to try to bring their stories back into the light and complete the narrative. And so that's what not only myself, but what a lot of people involved in the history aspect of the world try to do. So today we're going to talk about a gentleman who had his story left out of our nation's bigger picture. And I have to say that while one, stories like this gentleman's don't come up very often, it's so fascinating to have been able to read and research this gentleman because he just did something, like I said, we've never seen before, or at least I've never seen before. So the gentleman we're going to be discussing today, his name was Salem Poor. Salem Poor was a slave in the mid 1700s. So he was born into slavery in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in 1747. He was a slave up until he was 22 years old. When he was 22 years old, he had finally worked hard enough to be able to purchase his freedom. And that's an incredible thing. We don't really hear a lot of stories about slaves who bought their freedom. We know of a few, and we've heard a few stories, and we hold those people to high pedestals of historical importance. And many of them went on to become extremely, outspoken abolitionists or civil rights leaders later in life. And it's not really much of a different story here. So the thing that is different here, though, is not only did he buy his freedom, but he went on to do something incredible that changed the entire world and not just his own. So like I said, at age 22, Salem Poor was able to purchase his freedom. And his freedom cost him about 27 pounds. For anybody who doesn't know, pounds is the monetary system that was used and is still used by England and the United Kingdom and things like this. And 27 pounds was the big price. That's what it cost to remove himself from slavery. Which 27 pounds in 1769, when he was able to purchase his freedom, that was the equivalent to about a year's salary of the average working man. And when I say average working man, remember, we are primarily discussing white men. Okay, you're going to see a larger amount of average working white men than you are any other nationality or ethnicity at the time. Okay? And that's just, that in itself to me is incredible, because you have been put down your entire life and shown that there is just no way to get yourself out of it. I mean, you have to think about it. From the time Africans were brought to America, or to the West Indies, or to Central or South America, it doesn't really matter where they were brought, they were treated, obviously, brutishly. But it's not even just how they were treated. I mean, it's very important to remember these are people who were uprooted and sent across seas or across deserts to other nations and had their entire lives changed. they not only were beaten and enslaved and raped and things like that, but they were also conformed. They had their religions stripped from them, their languages stripped from them, their tribal patterns, their clothing, their jewelry. Okay, their families were torn apart, but their culture was literally extracted from them. They were converted to Catholicism, Protestantism, the Jesuit missionaries in South America did a lot of converting also. And they were assimilated. But they were also put down using those cultural changes. I can't tell you how many times I've read in one of my college classes a first-hand account written by a former slave, or seen a film based on true stories and writings from first-hand accounts about how slave masters and owners would use these biblical preachings to try to convince African slaves that that is what they were meant for. They were meant to be slaves. They weren't meant to be people. They weren't meant to be free. They would specifically leave out texts from the Bible. And this, I remember having a discussion about this with my theology professor back when I took theology, and it was the same thing also in Jamaica and in South America. These owners would leave out the sections where people rose up and stood up for themselves, or they walked away. They would leave out the entire story from the Bible about, the Jews leaving the enslavement of the Pharaoh and things like this. And they would purposely leave those out because they knew it was stories like that that would bring hope, and it would show the people that they were putting down that we don't have to take this. Because you have to remember, we have now made Bible believers out of these African slaves. And if you're going to make a believer out of them and they're going to read that text and go, oh, God and the Bible say that we don't have to be enslaved, well, then they're going to leave, or they're going to rise up and fight. And so literally we were using these cultural assimilation, and I say we, not meaning obviously us in the modern time, but I'm saying we as Americans. And I think everybody kind of understands what I mean by that. We as early colonists, the early colonists who were slave owners, or the South American Europeans who were slave owners, they were using the actual assimilations they forced onto people to keep them down. And the whole idea that we hear behind this all the time is that these assimilations were to, obviously this is a ridiculous reason, but to, quote, make them more civilized, unquote. Okay? And that's a terrible, absolutely terrible thing to say, that anybody is uncivilized because of the way they live. But that's what they did, and that's what they believed, and it's terrible. But then we have stories like this that defied those odds. Stories about people like Salem Poor who, through all of that, through all of the put down, found a way to get out. They knew they could get out. They rose up, or they earned their freedom, which I say earned, and that's a ridiculous thing to say, is that you earn your freedom, but he had to. 22 years old, and he had finally earned his freedom. 1769. He continued to live in Massachusetts for a while after that. He even met his first wife, Nancy Parker, in Massachusetts in about 1771. She was actually a maid to Captain James Parker. Captain James Parker later became a very influential figure with Massachusetts militias for the Revolutionary War. But Nancy Parker, she was half African American, half Native American. So he married someone who was of mixed descent of Native American and African American, which is incredible because, you know, a lot of times when we read about history, we know that there were mixing of the kind of social hierarchical, classes. But we know that it was frowned upon and they tried to keep it separate, you know. So it's very interesting that someone who was enslaved was permitted to marry a free man when she herself was half Native American and half African American. It's very shocking to read that a slave owner would allow that. So Salem Poor married Nancy Parker and bought her freedom. And they continued to live in Massachusetts for about another 4 years. And they even had a son. So now we see a man who, beyond all of the put down and all of the restraints, he was able to earn his freedom, to basically live the original American dream. He forced himself out of a bad spot, rebuilt his life, started a family, owned land. Okay, this is unheard of for a lot of free men in the mid 1700s, mid to late 1700s. So even just that is incredible. But this man was going to go on to become a hero. And that is my big reason for picking him today, because he did go on to be a hero. And he is a hero that widely goes unrecognized. In 1775, Salem Poor enlisted in the Massachusetts militia. Now, obviously, at the time, tensions between colonists and British soldiers were extremely high. Salem enlists in the militia, and he serves under Captain Benjamin Ames in Colonel James Fry's regiment. This was one of the regiments that helped to set up defenses on Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill, just in Boston. Okay. Then on June 16th, in 1775, Salem Poor was there at the Battle of Bunker Hill. He and his regiment marched from Cambridge to Charlestown, and about 350 men, including himself, met with 2 other regiments, and they stood atop Breed's Hill, which sits adjacent to Bunker Hill. And they waited because they knew a fight was coming. And on June 17th, that fight came. He watched as Bunker Hill was attacked by British forces. But he and his regiment didn't wait for the British to break through. They left Breed's Hill and ran to aid the other militia members at Bunker Hill. Ran right into the line of fire, ran right into the front lines. Okay? He wasn't alone. He went with, as I said, his 350 regiment men. But what's important to know is he was not the only man of color in that regiment. There were over 100 African Americans and Native Americans that were serving in that regiment. Okay? So a group of 100 people made up of African Americans and Native Americans, including Salem Poor, fought at one of the most infamous battles in American history. This is where Salem Poor should be remembered in history. This was his pinnacle moment. Okay? Obviously, Bunker Hill was a disaster for colonial forces. We consider it a spectacle of American victory simply because of the amount of British soldiers this small group of men was able to kill, injure, withhold before having to give up the hill. But it is not false to say that the Continentals took a heavy blow. Many soldiers lost their lives at Bunker Hill on both sides. Many officers lost their lives on both sides. But for the Continentals, they had lost some very important and influential people, starting with Major General Joseph Warren, who had aided in many of the Sons of Liberty campaigns leading up to this point. And it is widely believed that his death is what kept colonists in Massachusetts motivated to fight the British. But it was also his heroism that helped to save the lives of those retreating, because he remained with a small group of men on that hill and held back British forces. One of those men was Salem Poor. Salem Poor stood on that hill, a small group of men, against all of the English soldiers marching up that hill, getting off of their ships and coming right for them. And he fought to protect those that were retreating. That takes incredible courage. Without a doubt, that takes incredible courage. You have to remember, we don't know 100% how many soldiers were sent to Bunker Hill. For the colonists, it was roughly about 1,400, 1,200-ish troops in Continental forces that were serving under William Prescott and Joseph Warren. But for the British, it's estimated that there were about 3,000, if not more. Okay? So that is extremely outweighed odds. But still, these patriots stood and fought. And we hold them to high praise for it. But the one who deserves some of the highest, along with those officers, he doesn't receive it. So, like I said, they all fought to hold off these soldiers so that the Continental Militia could retreat and prepare for a fight that they knew was going to come, not only in Boston, with the sieging of Boston, but also in places like New York that were eventually invaded afterwards. And they stood on the hill and they fought these soldiers. And it is Salem Poor who is credited. Okay, and this is important. Salem Poor is credited with having killed the British lieutenant. He was a lieutenant colonel, okay, James Abercrombie. Now, a little information about Lieutenant Colonel James Abercrombie. James Abercrombie was the son of the renowned General James Abercrombie. He served at his father's side during the French and Indian War and received notable remarks during the Battle of Fort Carillon. Okay. The battle at Fort Carillon was a French victory. Britain did lose, but James Abercrombie Jr. fought so valiantly that he was given a promotion, and he ended up serving as the right hand to the Lord Amherst. Okay? So he served as the right hand to General Jeffrey Amherst, who once again was a incredibly notable general for British forces. For a while, he was the commander-in-chief of the British forces. Fast forward to the Battle of Bunker Hill and the assault on Breed's Hill. He has now become a lieutenant colonel, and he is leading his own regiment of British Grenadiers. And as he's marching with his British Grenadiers, he is shot in the leg and mortally wounded by Salem Poor. James Abercrombie died 3 days later. Salem Poor escaped. After holding the British off as long as they could, the rest of the men finally retreated and gave up the hill. Now, this was an incredible thing. You see, British soldiers were so well trained that they were trained to do multiple things. One of those things was they were trained to understand what order was being given based on the sounds of the drums and the flutes that were being played. This is why drummer boys and flute players were important targets, because in the heat of battle, with gunfire and screaming and cannons, it was hard to hear people calling out orders, but the drums could ring through all of that sound. The pipes could ring through all of that sound. The flutes could ring through all of that sound. So those that were put in regiments with drums and flutes and bagpipes and all these things were trained to know what orders were being given based on the sounds being played. So fire would be focused on them. But they were also trained to act upon the orders given by commanding officers. And officers like James Abercrombie, who go down in the field, leave battalions uncommanded. And so in the heat of battle, if you are a British soldier standing in a line, waiting to be given an order to fire, and that order never comes, you are now just a human shield wall for the people behind you. And that is what he did. That is what Salem Poor did. Salem Poor removed James Abercrombie from the battle and turned those men into targets. And it was enough to slow down the British, along with the help from the others that stayed to fight them off, that everyone was able to retreat. In fact, Salem Poor showed such valor and gallantry at the Battle of Bunker Hill that 14 officers, including Colonel William Prescott, the man who coordinated the entire battle, wrote a statement citing him for heroism and petitioned the General Court of Massachusetts to submit him to Congress so that he may be given a reward and may be given a rank or statement in honor of that gallantry and bravery. Now, here is the most interesting part about that. Not only are we talking about a man who was born into slavery and at the young age of 22 bought his own freedom, established a new life, created a family, had land, had a home, had a deed written in his name, had a marriage license written in his name. He now was receiving recognitions and awards for being a gallant soldier. No other soldier in the American Revolution received the recognition that he did. No other soldier had 14 commanding officers write a recommendation for him to be rewarded. No other soldier in the American Revolution was granted the reward that he was. Rather, the award that he was. The recognition that he received. After that, George Washington had called for an end to the recruitment of African Americans in the Continental Army. And he had also called for the discharge of any that were already serving. Now, the British were not fools. The British took that in stride. And the governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, decided that he would offer any slaves freedom to fight for the British. Washington then immediately changed his mind and reopened the army to free black men and opened it to slaves. And he said that they would free any slaves that served for a certain amount of time, and any free men or slaves that became free after serving that time, the extra time that they served in the military, they would be paid for it. So now, not only has he received all these recognitions, not only has he bought his freedom, established a new life, but now Salem Poor was being paid to be a soldier. He went on to serve in much of the remainder of the Revolution. And he even served with Benedict Arnold. Salem Poor fought under the command of Benedict Arnold at the Battle of White Plains on October 28th in 1776, which was a terrible defeat for the Continentals. Yet he managed to escape with his life, which is incredible. He then continued to fight under Benedict Arnold at the Battle of Saratoga, which was an incredible victory for the Americans. It is also said to be where Benedict Arnold, that American colonists knew and loved, died. Because it was after this battle, it was after the Battle of Saratoga, after Benedict Arnold had received his injury, that George Washington no longer wanted him to serve in the field. George Washington had done this multiple times, where he would leave someone out of the field in hopes of protecting them so that they could help to establish the new government that would come after the war. And he tried to do that to Benedict Arnold, and that is what many believe is mainly what pushed Benedict Arnold to betray the Americans. Salem Poor was there. He was there when Arnold was shot. He was fighting by his side. He was there in White Plains when the Americans lost and had to retreat. After that, he went and entered the winter camp at Valley Forge. Okay? For those that don't know, the Continental forces camped in Valley Forge from October of 1777 to roughly June of 1778. They were there for the entire winter and a part of the spring. Whenever you watch a Revolutionary War movie, let's take The Patriot, for example. The Patriot by Mel Gibson. There is a scene in the movie where the character played by Heath Ledger is sitting, bundled up under a blanket, shivering as he's writing a letter to his family. And part of that scene, the camera scans the area, and there are just bodies lying there dead. Soldiers that had frozen or starved or died from disease. That is pretty much the scene of Valley Forge. Valley Forge was awful for Continental soldiers because, one, they were running out of supplies. They had run out of supplies. Two, not all soldiers had shelter. Not all soldiers had a tent. Some had to sleep out under the simple sky and snow. Three, not all soldiers had proper clothes. Some of the soldiers were far too underdressed. In fact, I remember reading a first-hand account from a soldier at Valley Forge that one of the men in his regiment had died, and they took his boots and his coat and his blanket and left his body there because many of the soldiers had improper boots and were susceptible to diseases, or had improper clothing and were susceptible to freezing. Salem Poor experienced that. He lived through it. He survived it. After living in Valley Forge, he went on to fight at the Battle of Monmouth, and then he continued fighting with Patriot forces until 1780. The war ended or is said to have ended, in 1781 after the British defeat at Yorktown. Salem Poor served almost the entire Revolutionary War, lived through the worst of the worst, fought in some of the worst battles, survived the worst of the worst, survived those battles, fought in some of the greatest victories, fought alongside some of the most highly held members of American history. He fought alongside George Washington. He fought alongside Benedict Arnold and Alexander Hamilton and Benjamin Talmadge and so many more. After he left the army, he married his second wife. This time, his wife, Mary Twing, was a free African American former slave. They settled down together in Providence, Rhode Island, but their marriage ended in about 1785. After that, he did something else absolutely incredible. He married a white woman by the name of Sarah Stevens in 1787. So now I want you to imagine this. Here is an African American man, a former slave, in 1787, marrying a white woman. I didn't say trying to marry. He did. He married her. He got a marriage license with his name on it and her name on it. A black man married a white woman in 1787. But fast forward to the Civil Rights Movement. Fast forward to the campaigns of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Okay? That never would have happened. That was so wrong and immoral. Yet, here is a man doing it in the late 1700s. This man did something absolutely incredible. Not even in the 1800s would an African American man have been allowed to marry a white woman, or vice versa. It didn't matter. But here is an example of a man who literally defied all of the odds. After he married Sarah Stevens, they returned to Boston. He moved back to Boston with her, and they lived together there for a brief period. I believe they moved there, according to the research that I have done, they moved back there in about 1790. And in 1793, he was arrested. Now, the charges, it's hard to understand what he was doing when he was arrested. He was charged and thrown in jail for breaching the peace. Okay. Breaching the peace could be everything from public intoxication to a verbal confrontation in the street, to a brawl in the street, to a bar brawl. There are so many things that fall under breach of peace that there's no really way for me to be able to tell you what exactly he did without finding the actual document saying what he was arrested for, if that document even exists. So he was arrested in about 1793, and he spent several weeks in jail. He was arrested again for breach of peace in 1799. This time, he was there for roughly a year. Okay? And he was released from jail for breach of peace in 1800. It was at this time that he married his fourth and final wife. Okay, 1801, he married his fourth and final wife. They were only married for a year before he died in his home in Boston. Currently, it is unknown where the location of his grave is. Okay? And the reason I say currently and not definitely is because in cities like Boston and New York and Philadelphia, anytime they go to do construction or they renovate something, it's very common for them to come across remains. And then for those remains to be identified or possibly a guess of who they are or interned as unknown soldiers. Okay? So that's why I say it's currently unknown where his grave is. We simply know he's buried somewhere in Boston. And that was all that was heard of him. His story was never told. Nothing ever came of it. Nobody knew who he was outside of the soldiers that served with him. In 1975, though, he was given an honor by the U.S. Postal Service. The U.S. Postal Service decided to put him on a stamp for the 200th anniversary of the Battle of Bunker Hill to honor his heroism during the battle. And since 1975, there has not been anything else that has come out for him. Okay, Salem Poor has gone completely out of history. And I say completely out of history in kind of a poor way, because he didn't go 100% out of history. Okay, we know he existed. We have the documentation, the evidence. Okay, we have commemorative stamps with his face on it. There is a Smithsonian exhibit for him that comes up every once in a while in the United States History Department. Okay? But outside of that, he's not taught in history books. There's no books on his heroism. He's an unknown name. He's not like the household names that everybody knows. Samuel Adams, John Adams, George Washington. He's not one of those soldiers everyone knows. But he was just as brave and gallant as those soldiers. So that is my reasoning for selecting Salem Poor to be the first person that has his story told in our podcast. A man who defied every odd that was against him. Defied every single odd that was against him. Okay? A man who did the unthinkable by earning his way out of slavery, by marrying a white woman, by serving through all of the major points of the Revolution and experiencing those and experiencing people like George Washington, Benedict Arnold, Alexander Hamilton, people like this. He deserves to have his story told. He deserves to be put back into the narrative of American history, to be honored for it. Because once again, nobody else in the Continental Forces in the American Revolution received the honor that he did to have 14 commanding officers write to the courts and to Congress to honor him, and then to turn around and be honored by Congress. Let alone him being a free black man, a free black soldier. No one else received that honor. And that is why he was selected to be our first person that is discussed in this podcast. So if you stayed with me through the entire podcast, I want to say thank you for tuning in. I also want to encourage all of you that if there is someone you would like me to research and talk about, or if there is an event you would like me to talk about, please, please, please comment. You can DM me, reach out, contact me, and I will set up to schedule for that to come out in our conversations here. Because it is important to not only myself, but to all historians, that we start painting the actual picture again. It's been a long time since we have sat down and gone back and looked at all parties involved in a lot of things. And there are many people that have done incredible things, invented, created incredible things. Okay? There's a mass amount of people who are African American, Native American, Irish American, Indian American, Scottish American, LGBT, women, all of these different ethnicities, races, gender, sexual orientations. And they did these incredible things in history, or created these incredible things in history, and they are not given the credit that they deserve. They're not given the honor that they deserve. And it's time that we put them back into the historical narrative. So once again, I want to thank you for listening to the podcast. Please reach out to me if there's any topic you would like me to cover. If you're interested, you can go and listen to our other podcast videos that are in the political section or the miscellaneous section of the YouTube page. And I ask that everybody subscribe to the page, punch that notification bell so that you can get updates when we post fresh content. Thank you.